I have two basic premises that undergird my understanding of racism in America. Premise number one is that the United States has historically, consistently, and constantly discriminated against certain ethnic groups. It did this by creating really an artificial category called white, allowing certain people groups to occupy that category, and then elevated that category over another category of people that we'll call non-white. And various people groups have occupied that category. What people groups, you might ask? Funny enough, there are some people groups that used to be considered non-white, but were able to elevate into the category of white that we consider white today. So Irish, when they first started coming to this country, Italians, when they first started coming to this country, all were considered non-white. But I'd say the most persistent members of the non-white category in our country have been Native Americans. It's been Latinos, it's been Asians, and of course, it's been black people. So that leads me to the second premise I want to give, which is that the historic, consistent, and constant discrimination in our country has had its most severe and long-lasting impact on black people. When I say most severe impact, I'm talking about things like slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, all things that have had severe impact on black people. It's brought severe suffering on black people. It's a racist system that for most of the history of our country has been the norm for our country, and it was fueled by racist beliefs and racist ideas. Now, thankfully, a lot of that system has been dismantled. We've had some huge victories in dealing with that racist system. So, abolition, civil rights legislation. Thankful that not all of the system has been dismantled, but a lot of it has. But that's why my premise also says that this historic, consistent, and constant discrimination has not just had its most severe impact on black people, it's also had its most long-lasting impact on black people. This discrimination has a long tail to it, and we're not yet completely out of it. We have never really fully dealt with the long tail, the long effect, if you will, of discrimination on black people in this country. My house currently has a termite problem. So if you've had termites, you know they should manifest themselves as sort of it looks like a long, thin gray trail that is on your walls, sometimes even sort of hangs down from your ceiling. Every time I see those termites, those trails, those long, gray, thin trails, I mean, there's little termites all within that sort of long, it looks like a long, gray, thin trail of dust, and there's little termites all within that trail. I immediately want to clean it up. I want to wipe it away and put it into a napkin and throw it away. I don't want to see that. I want to get rid of it. However, what my exterminator has explained to me, unfortunately, is that getting rid of those trails doesn't actually deal with the termite problem. The termite problem is actually in the walls. The trails are just the physical manifestation of the deeper problem of termites that are all within the walls, especially of older houses. And so, as you might imagine, the exterminator has told me, you got to get in the walls. It's going to be costly. It's going to cost some dust. There's going to be some work that has to be done to get into the walls and deal with the termites that are there. And it's something that you probably going to have to consistently do over multiple years. You might always have to do to deal with those termites. Racism is in the walls of our country. It's in the walls. The most recent events are just the most recent physical manifestations, the most visible manifestations of a problem that's in the walls of our country. And my question is, maybe now we're finally willing to admit that what we've been doing is cleaning the trails off. Thankful that we do that, but not really dealing with the problem. The question is, will we get into the walls? Perhaps we haven't because it's costly, it's painful. You've got to drill into the very structures of our country and deal with issues that perhaps are deeper in the wood of our country than we're willing to admit. But the only way to really deal with it is by getting into the walls. So let's think about some of those recent events. George Floyd. You understand, he's just the most recent example of a deeper problem of racism that's in the walls of our country. And I describe it as this: the violent response to alleged black crimes. That's been historically a consistent and constant problem in our country. Something that's in the walls. We can only deal with it by admitting that and going to the root. That's the only way to unroot something like that. A second example, recent example, of course, is Ahmaud Arbery and what happened with him. He's the most recent example of a deeper problem that I described this way: the predetermined assumptions about the criminality of black people. A deeper problem. It's in the walls. Ahmaud Arbery is just the most recent manifestation of that deeper problem. Let's look at a third one. What almost happened with Christian Cooper and the woman who called the cops on Christian Cooper, or tried to. That incident is the most recent example of a deeper problem that's in the walls of our country. And I describe it this way: the predetermined assumptions that black people are a dangerous threat. Like I said, that's what happened with Christian Cooper. That's just the most recent expression of that deeper issue. Again, racism, it's in the walls. We can only really deal with it if we're willing to get into the walls, really willing to deal with the long-term impact of discrimination on our country that continues to affect us today. Now let me say this: some of you almost need to stop right there, because this is the issue to really wrestle with and deal with. That you can't really go farther. It almost be a detriment to you to begin to wrestle and debate all the different solutions, maybe how you're going to get into the walls and how you're going to deal with all those things, because you have trouble seeing racism as being in the walls. You still see it as just a termite trail. And that's all it is. It's just a thin trail of dust that you can wipe away and you'll be fine. And you've done it a lot of times, and you're sort of prone to still continue doing that. I get it, because it's scary and it's hard to think of what it will mean to get into the walls. But this is the question to wrestle with. Don't go further on this journey without wrestling with that question, or at least doing the research, talking, and at least beginning to open your mind and understanding to how maybe the reason these things keep popping up year after year, decade after decade, similar incidents, is because it's a deeper problem that's in the walls. If you're a Christian, I'm going to challenge you and say, like, you should be a little bit more on the way of at least of accepting that this can be the case. Because as Christians, we understand that our Bible often talks about how sin and racism is ultimately sin. In a biblical category, that's what we understand. Racism is an expression of sin. That sin is something that can get into the walls of a people. It can get into the walls of a nation. Over and over in the Bible, we see different people saying and speaking to particularly God's people at various points. For a lot of the period of the Bible, God's people were the Israelites, and over saying, speaking to the ways in which different sins that they had were sort of almost embedded within that people, within them, ways in which they did not follow God, specific ways in which they didn't follow God. One of the examples I always think of is in Acts 7. This is Stephen. He's talking to a group of Jewish authorities who had unfairly arrested him and would soon kill him. And before they kill him, here's what he says. He says this in Acts 7, verses 51 to 53. "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you." You do the same thing that's been done in the past. "Which other prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it." These are the walls of the Israelite people, to not listen to God, but specifically to not listen to God's spokesman. And he's saying, look, you've done this in the past, and here's the most recent example of it. You killed Jesus. And the authorities of that day did not like that, and so they stoned him to death. This has always been a hard problem to admit and to deal with. But here we are. Can we finally see this for what it is? Racism, it's in the walls. Are we willing to do the work? Are we willing to to take the time to make the investment, to begin to do the things that maybe can at least begin to help us heal, help us recover. I want to just always say, I have hope that we can. Maybe this time will be different.